So we're in Deuteronomy. You can go ahead and turn over there if you brought your Bibles with you and you want to follow along in Deuteronomy chapter 4. If you have it on a phone, go ahead and pull that up with an app or a Google search. I'm going to be kind of highlighting some pieces as we go through. Deuteronomy 4 is a longer chapter. If I gave it a minute per verse, I think we'd be here for quite a while. And I never give just a minute to a verse, it seems. But we're going to hit some highlights as we go through here. As I think about Deuteronomy chapter 4, this picture kind of comes to mind for me. You know how you have a book, and on the back of the book, there will be sort of a synopsis of the book, or maybe there's some recommendations that you'll get, but basically some sort of description of what that book is about. Deuteronomy 4 is sort of like that summary or that synopsis for the whole of Deuteronomy. You can read Deuteronomy 4 and get an idea for what the whole of the book of Deuteronomy is about and what to do with the next set of things. And so I'll touch on that in a second here, but kicking things off, just going right away into Deuteronomy 4, verse 1, we read, "And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them, that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you." Deuteronomy 4 is the application section of Moses' first speech in Deuteronomy. So there's these three different speeches that Moses gives. The first one opens up in Deuteronomy chapter 1, and we've been following along with that for the last few weeks. Moses is going over the faithfulness of God to the faithless generation of Israel, the first generation. So he kind of is going through their most recent history. And then he's been talking about how the generations have shifted, and now Israel itself, this second generation of this country, has had opportunity to see God prove himself faithful to them. And now he's shifted modes and he's moved into the application section, saying, God's been faithful, we've been faithless, so what needs to change? We need to become faithful. We need to listen to the statutes and the rules that I'm teaching you and do them. So it's his application from his brief history lesson. Like I kind of said, it's also the introduction in a way to the following speeches that are coming. If you were to scroll or move all the way down to the end of the chapter, you're going to see the last paragraph there runs through everything he just said in terms of history, and it kind of foreshadows this call again to obedience and listening to the laws. Because Deuteronomy 4 is sort of this transition moment in the book where we're getting ready to hear what are the rules and the statutes that we're supposed to pay attention to and be faithful to. So that's kind of what's happening in Deuteronomy 4. Kind of a big overview picture. The main point is this: Israel must worship the Lord through obedience because he is holy. That's the central idea for this chapter. And what I want to do, because again, it's a longer chapter, I want to hit some highlights to help see how Moses develops this call. We've already seen him call to obedience, but the first question that I want to ask is, what was the Lord's goal? What was God's goal in giving this covenant, these rules, these laws, these regulations? What was he going after when he gave that to Israel? And so we start in verse 5. Moses says, "See, look, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples." So the Lord has a goal here. He has an expectation, he has an objective in mind as he gives these rules and these regulations, these laws, this sort of legal code to his people. And there's two parts to it. The first part we see as and this is like painfully simple, so bear with me. But he says that you should do them. Right? Now, that's about as basic as it gets. If I tell my kids, I want you to go clean your room, what I'm hoping is going to happen is that they go clean their room. right? I don't want them to come to me and be like, Dad, I feel right now that there's just like a little bit of tension between us, and we just need to work through that. That's not what I'm going after. I want them to listen to me. And God has the same objective here. He has called out Israel as a people, and then He's given them a way of living, rules for living. And He is looking for obedience. So that's objective number one. That might be difficult for us to kind of wrap our heads around a little bit, because we're used to thinking about the law through the Apostle Paul saying things like, it reveals sin, but doesn't give you the power to obey. And so sometimes we can look at this and we can sort of dismiss the law and not pay attention to it, but we're doing a disservice to ourselves if we do that too quickly. God's goal in giving the law was not that Israel would say something like, this is too difficult, this is too hard, wow, I get it, I'm sinful, I'm guilty, I'm shameful. That's not the purpose that God says He was going after. He gave them rules, He gave them a law for them to follow. Okay? Obedience. The second thing, though, that He goes after, we see going back into the text, is He says, I want you to keep and do the law because or for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So these laws, as they keep them and as they do them, as they observe them, are going to do something to Israel. It's going to sort of shift something. And then when the nations are watching the history of Israel play out, as Israel keeps and does these commands, they're going to notice this shift. They're going to notice that there's something unique and different about Israel, and they're going to comment to themselves, what a great nation that is. How wise they are when they administer their justice and when they run their court systems and when they deal with like family disputes or neighbor disputes or all these different things. The nations are going to acknowledge that there is a wisdom here. And this is one of God's objectives, that the law transforms Israel into wisdom, or brings wisdom to Israel. Now, this picture, I think that this is exciting simply because of a previous story in the Bible. So previously, on yesterday, how did that go? Previously on last week's show, or whatever, Adam and Eve were in the garden. And Adam and Eve were seeking the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to know what to do, how to live a good life, how to avoid an evil life. Right? And God said, trust me. And they said, no. They said, let's go to this other source for good. This other source to understand evil. And we're going to figure this out on our own because that builds us up. That elevates us. And then we're not like under the boot of God. And that quest for the knowledge of good and evil is one way of understanding human culture, I think. That quest for understanding, what is the right way for us to live and build our culture? What are our values? How are we going to figure that out? What are the things that we don't want our people to do? How are we going to put a legal system in place to prevent our people from living that way? It's a pursuit of good and evil. And what God is saying here is that the original failure of people to let me help them with that, I'm going to undo. I'm going to fix. And I'm going to bring to you, Israel, the knowledge of good and evil. So that everybody else who's searching for this wisdom out there is going to recognize that something's working in Israel. And the decision that Adam and Eve were supposed to make, which was trust God to teach them good and evil, is now the exact same decision that he's inviting Israel into. Moses is inviting Israel into. Trust God for your knowledge of good and your knowledge of evil. Obey God, trust Him, and find wisdom. I find that exciting. And so we get our main point, right? Here's the main deal. Israel must worship the Lord, and what do we see? Through obedience, right? Obedience is this primary idea in Deuteronomy 4. Obey God. It's what he's asking of you, and it's going to form wisdom in you, so it's a good thing. But we could ask the question, why is it that obedience is the only way to worship the Lord? Like, why can't there be something else? Why couldn't we say, worship the Lord by being authentic and true to our hearts? Why couldn't we worship the Lord the way that the Amorites are worshiping their Lord, with child sacrifices? Why couldn't we worship the Lord the way ... Why this way? All right? So we keep moving forward and we get to verse 11. Moses is reminding them what it was like when God first gave them the rules, when God first gave them the law. He says, "And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom." I didn't do a word search to see how many times gloom shows up in the Bible. It's not often. I just know that. But I love how atmospheric this moment is. I think in speech class you're not supposed to, they tell you never to ask people to close their eyes and picture something. So I won't ask you to close your eyes and picture something. But picture this. A mountain, maybe the Rockies, maybe something closer to the Black Hills. What if all of hope went out and we just kind of did this caravan over there, got out of our cars, stood at the mountain, and then the mountain erupted in fire as high as we could see, like we couldn't even see the tops of the blaze, and clouds of smoke are billowing out of the fire to the point that you can't see the sun anymore. Your only source of light is this fire engulfing the mountain in front of you. And a sense of gloom just like kind of drops and settles over everyone. Can you look away from that? I wouldn't. It's captivating and terrifying. And this is the moment when God gave his law. We keep reading, continuing. "Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire, and you heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is, the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone." So there's a few elements within this story. First of all, this is incredibly public. Last week we got to hear a little bit about, if you were part of the missions conference, there was some information that we were given about the religion of Islam. And at the beginning of that religion, you have a man by himself in a cave with a word from God. Is that how this starts? It isn't. You have an entire nation gathered around a mountain in about the most public way possible. God descending on the mountain, burning the whole thing up, and speaking not to their leader, but to them directly. Now Moses does go into a cave, not a cave, but he does go up the mountain eventually, and he's hidden by the cloud. He comes down with more rules. But could you imagine Moses coming down the mountain after they've already received the 10 Commandments directly from God? And Moses coming down and saying, all right, so here's how it's going to work. I want you to each give me one of your wives, because that's what God says. It wouldn't work, would it? Because God has already spoken directly to them. And they have something to check and hold accountable their own leader against. They know the way of God because God gave it to them and spoke to them. So this is public. And yet it's formless. Now Moses makes a big deal out of this. He's like, take care that you remember it was a voice, but no form. The form seems to be hidden, if you will, behind the fire. And we're kind of pulling on all the other pieces as we say this. But God spoke to you. He didn't show himself to you in true full form. Okay? What he did put first and forefront to you was his voice. It was the things he said. And then he clarifies for us, just in case you were wondering, like, what would it have been like? I wonder what God said in that moment. Well, you don't have to wonder about what God said in that moment. He gave the 10 Commandments. That's what he said. And you can check this in Exodus 19 and 20. That's where this story is, recorded, kind of drawn out. And God speaks to Israel and he says, here is how I want you to relate to me. Here is how I want you to relate to each other as my people. And that is how God revealed himself, through a voice. And then Moses draws attention back to this fire thing. That voice was hidden behind the fire. And the fire is doing sort of two things, I think. On one hand, fires draw people in, don't they? Like, people love a good bonfire, and you want to, like, you can get transfixed by the fire, and there's a drawing in that happens with a fire. Everybody's focused on this. But at the same time, fires drive people away. Fires are division. Fires consume. Fires burn. And so Israel is getting this dual picture. God is guarded from them. His form is hidden from them by the fire. But it's also this thing that draws them in, because what God has ever revealed himself like this? So publicly, so powerfully. Could you imagine being Israel in that moment and being like, okay, what's next? And moving on? Like, that was a neat national monument, but I'm going to go check out the new IMAX show. I think I heard about Baal over on Mount Carmel. He's got this thing going on, so we're going to go check that out next. It doesn't work. Like, the fire is encompassing. Jackson, you were telling me, I couldn't remember the word you were sharing with me earlier this week about beauty that is more than just pretty, but it's awesome. Engages you and overwhelms you. You can ask Jackson later on what that word is. And so it invites us to ask this question, well, how do you worship a God who has so publicly revealed himself like this? Through a formless voice hidden behind fire. How do you worship him? You listen to his voice. That's what you do. What other options has he given you in terms of relating to him? You can't go up there and then do a sketch of what God was like. The fire keeps you from doing that. You can't just imagine what he's like, because it was a public display of who he is. So you can't just make your own thing up. You can't disregard the voice. Could you imagine the power present in a being like this, who then calls and speaks to you and says, you are my people. You are my possession, my inheritance. The ones who I will form. My people. Obey me. What are you going to do? Just run away from the one who can consume a mountain? You can't. The option that he presents us with is listening to him and obeying him. And so that's where this all comes from. Like, why is there such a big call for obedience? It's because that's how God has revealed himself. And he's inviting a response from us. God has said, I am your God, you're my people, so live this way. So if we're going to worship him, then we can't dismiss what he says. We have to honor what he says. So Israel must worship the Lord through obedience, because he is holy. Now, this idea of holiness, in one way we've really already laid that out. God on the mountain, there's really nothing like this. And that's the essence of holiness. There is no one like him. And with that, God has kept himself separate from any other God. No other God has done this, but separate also from his people, as the fire forms this barrier around him. And that's sort of these two things together form our concept of holiness. There is no one like him. He is separate unto himself. But Moses is sort of wrapping up thoughts, and he kind of nails this down for us. In verse 32, he says, "For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth." Okay, so as far back as we can possibly imagine. "Ask from one end of heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of." What are you going to compare this to? The mythologies of Egypt? Not as public, not as intentional, not as divine invading human space to speak with his people. Doesn't work. And Moses, from verse 32 on down to verse 39, goes through thing after thing after thing, saying what God has done this. What God has rescued a people from another nation. Gone in there, overpowered all of their gods, rescued them out miraculously, and formed out of nobodies the greatest nation, separate unto himself. What God has that story? What nation has that story? What nation has the story of their God publicly speaking, not just to the leader in private, not just to the priests, kind of when they're off in their temple by themselves, but he spoke to all of us and gave his law to all of us. Who's got that story? Who is like our God? What God has removed every single obstacle between us and his promises? He moved the Amorites out of the way. He's moved the giants out of the way. He's even moved, in a way, our own failures out of the way as he graciously chose not to wipe us out, but to wait a generation and come back to his promises for us. That God keeps removing obstacles between his people and his promises, and he will give us the promised land. Who has a story where the voice from heaven invaded earth? And his point is that God is holy. And so in verse 39, he lands it all. He says, "Know therefore today, lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven. And on the earth, the Lord is God in heaven above. And on the earth beneath, there is no other." God is holy. And he's invited us into a relationship with him through his voice, declaring to us the 10 Commandments. "I will be your God, and you will be my people. Obey me, find wisdom." All right. So I've got a series of questions at the end here. Rhetorical, don't worry about it. Where's Jesus in this? How do we see and recognize Jesus? How do we follow Jesus after hearing this story? Well, first, what God has formed a people out of the nations? That's Moses' question. And he points back to the way that their God overcame the greatest superpower, Egypt, to rescue his people out of the nations. And this is Jesus' story. Jesus is the one who has gone to the nations and rescued a people for himself. He's formed a people where there was no people. More than that, he's gone into the kingdom of darkness, this place run by the head of demons, Satan, who has authority over us because we are all liars, rebels of God, who have decided that we are going to find our own truth. We're going to find our own evil. And Jesus invaded that kingdom, and he formed a people out of those he rescued from there. That's our story. Jesus is the God who has formed a people out of the nations. Moses talks about what God has invaded the physical world so tangibly, as dropping fire down on a mountain, as a voice speaking to all the peoples unquestionably. Who else can point to a story like this in their origin of their nation? The U.S. can't. We don't have anything near that. But God did this. And you know what? This is Jesus' story, isn't it? Jesus is the one who has invaded our physical world. And you know what? I'm sorry, Moses, but he one-ups your fire mountain. Because Jesus came as the Word to us, right? He's the one who reveals God to us. Was he formless? No. He is the Word in flesh. He is greater than this moment. And he has just as powerfully brought God's presence to his people, but then he's gone further and he's invited relationship that goes through the fire. Jesus is the greater divine entrance into the physical world. And keep going, right? We have 2 more questions. What God has defeated every single enemy and every single obstacle between his people and the promised land, or the promises. Right? This is the story of God taking first and second generation of Israel and slowly showing them that he can overpower their enemies, that there's no one who can keep him from giving the promised land to his people. Moses is saying, do you see this? Trust him. What God can do this? The Amorite God couldn't stop them. He actually references a story where the king of, let me see if I'm going to get this right, Moab, is like, we can't stand up to this God. The only thing that we can do is get this God to curse his own people. And so he tries to run that, and it doesn't really work. Because God can overcome any obstacle between his people and his promises. And that is Jesus' story. The obstacles that Jesus went through. He ran over Satan. He just blew past him, Satan trying to say, no, I have claims over these people. Like Aslan's white witch, or not Aslan's white, like Lewis's white witch, saying, I have a claim over Edmund. He is a liar and a betrayer. And Aslan just goes right past her and says, no, he's mine. Why? Because Aslan is willing to take the punishment like Jesus took the punishment for us. He became the liar and he became the betrayer. So that you and I never face that. And Satan's claim evaporates over you. And it's the judgment of God himself that's leveled against us, the wrath of God. Because what happens if Israel decides to walk away from the mountain disinterested? What happens if Israel decides to take God and try to create their own form of him that they can control and minimize and manipulate? They get kicked out of the promised land. They get banished because of the wrath of God against them. And you expand that to the basic issue of humanity, we're all doing that. Either walking away from God or trying to control him with our religion. And so the wrath of God is against us, banishing us from his eternal presence. And Jesus takes that. And his death is our death. His resurrection is the power of God to remove the obstacles and the enemies between his people and his promises. Jesus overcame all those things for us. There's nothing that stands between us and God. His love for us and his promises to us. Last question. The center of this story is Moses' exhortation for people to obey the law. Right? He's saying, obey the statutes. And if you do, it's going to form wisdom in you in a way that everybody around you will see. And he's saying, what God has ever provided a law to a people like that? What God has ever answered the search for wisdom inherent to humanity and been able to satisfy that curiosity, to be able to create a morality and an ethics that works? There's no other God who can do that. That's why Israel is going to stand heads and shoulders above everyone else. Because God himself is going to teach good and evil. Well, that's Jesus' story. Jesus is the one who today people are still fighting over. If you just step out into the world, they're like, no, he's my social justice activist. He's the one who overturns and undercuts power the way that I want him to, because he's impacting the whole last 2,000 years of the Western world. The way that he taught how to live and relate to God and relate to others is still a model for all sorts of people, regardless of whether they see him as divine. In a greater way than Israel and Moses ever really found. Now that's not really even the whole point. Because what Jesus does is he goes and he says, here, let me put the mind of God in you, the way that Paul says it. Let me bring the Spirit of God into your heart. The truth that you're looking for and the evil that you want to make sure you can identify, the Spirit of God is going to help you with that. Forever now. That blows past the Ten Commandments. Jesus is greater and fulfills all of this. And he calls us to the same thing that Moses calls Israel. Jesus says, now, worship me by following me through obedience to all that I have commanded you. Because I am holy, and there is none like me. So I just want to leave that with us today. Please pray with me.